Keep the language down.
All right, good evening, and I want to thank the Inlet Historical Society for inviting me to speak to all of you tonight. It's an honor, really. I would also like to take a moment to again thank all of the volunteers who make these programs possible for us and the goals of the society, the noble goals of the society. In particular, I must thank Charles Herr for the interest and the enthusiasm he has brought to the local history here at Inlet. And not only that, but also all of the time and the effort that he just spent with me for the last 2 months, every Wednesday, maybe Thursday, whichever. So thank you very much. Would you please join me in a round of applause for the volunteers and for Charles. As we go through the slides, you'll see that my family surname is spelled 3 different ways. Those are not typos. My great-grandparents, when they immigrated to the United States, the oldest one kept the old name, the middle one modified it, and my grandfather, who was a first-generation American, he was born here in Deerfield, New York, he sort of modernized it. So I'm not making spelling errors, it's the way that they are. So the Gribneau family story. We are descendants of European immigrants who, like many other families in this room, carved homes and livelihoods out of a wild forest. It is also the story of a summertime romance which bloomed and lasted a lifetime, and I am sure beyond. My family has been involved in Inlet, New York for at least 99 years that I can testify to. In that time, we have owned 13 properties in the town of Inlet, 10 of which are on the 7th Lake Road, where my ancestors started. And we also have bought and purchased 8 properties or more in the town of Webb. I didn't count all the Hollywood Hills lots that my father bought specifically to lumber and then resold for vacation homes. Those are not included because they were temporary. Could we go to the next slide?
Thank you.
Next slide, I forgot.
That was the clue.
Okay, Clayton and Gert, as my parents were known, I'm sorry, go back to that one, I'm sorry. Go back one, please.
I can do that.
I'm sorry. Okay, they were founders of at least 6 businesses in this community and this area. They initially Clayton's Cottages, and for a while during World War II, Clayton's Grocery Store, then Clayton's Motel, then Middlebrook Motel, and simultaneous with those, Clayton Gribneau and Sons Construction Company, and also Clayton Gribneau's Logging Incorporated. And all the while they were running those businesses, they were raising 4 daughters and 4 sons. Next, please. Okay. Here's my parents' full names. Clayton Alford Sr. and Josephine Gilia Gertrude Burth Gribneau. They are parents of 8 children, 18 grandchildren, 35 great-grandchildren, and 4, soon to be 4, great-grandchildren, in all 65 descendants presently. To appreciate their story, you must know one thing. Both of my parents lost their childhood home at a very young age. My mother was only 8, and my father was 12. And this colored their entire life and the decisions they made later. So, as a result of this childhood tragedy, really, it was important to them to provide a very stable and permanent home for their family. This was of paramount importance to both of them. And as such, before my dad was married, he had acquired land for a homestead and had at least 3 cottages built before he married my mother. He was still a minor. After their marriage, my father lived 53 years in his home until he died there. And my mother arrived there the day as a bride, and she lived just short of 75 years in this permanent home. And then she passed away in 2013. Through their efforts and determination and commitment, I and my siblings had the security of 1 permanent address, 1 phone number, our entire lives growing up. Sadly, this is something neither of my parents had. In this era today of the unfortunate homelessness and broken homes for way too many people, this was and remains indeed a great blessing to have received for myself and my siblings. As such, I believe my siblings and I are fortunate to have been raised as an Adirondack natives. Who could ask for more? Now, for those of you who didn't know my parents, I wanted to include a couple of quotes to give you a sense of who they were. My dad, he would say, "Life is just the way you make it. It's all how you choose to look at things." And he'd come out with, "It's a rough old world, but you've got to just keep on going." Or, "You can laugh or you can cry. It's better to laugh." In fact, he even told us funny stories when he was dying. I remember Linda Nelson came to our house when he was dying, and I was giggling, and my father was dying. But I said, he was just that way. He was a comical character at times.
Can you explain why I came there?
I don't remember why you were there.
It was the first time I ever run for tax
petitions.
collector.
She wanted a petition
I was
signed.
going everywhere knocking on doors. I didn't know Dave or his family or anything. I'm knocking on their door and saying, "Come on in, my father's dying, but we'll sign your petition."
Well, he would have approved. Next, Charles. Okay, and these are some of my mother's quotes that I will never forget. "Life is all about letting go of those you've lost." And then she added, "while always holding them firmly within your heart." And when there was strife in the family, she'd oftentimes say, "Be the bigger person. Let heaven settle it. You won't regret it, and in the end, you'll be a happier person." And a short time before she died, she said, "I just wanted to leave the world better than I found it." I believe both my parents clearly did just that. Next, please. And here they are on their wedding day, October 28th, 1939. They're standing in front of the Little Shamrock restaurant where my great aunt Edith made them a breakfast reception. They were married at St. Anthony's Rectory. It was just my mom and dad, her sister Marie, and her brother Earl George Burth at the Little Shamrock. Next, please.
Where was that?
You're going to find out.
Oh,
There's the sign, and this is my parents leaving the wedding breakfast at the Little Shamrock, and they went to the World's Fair in New York City of 1939. So this was October 28th, 1939. And 13 months later, the family started to grow. Their first baby was my sister Kathleen Marie, who we called Kay. Next, please. Now, by their 65th birthday in 1988, this is at the lakefront at Camp Clayton. This was in July of 1988. Let me try this thing. Okay, obviously we have my father, Clayton, here. My mother, sorry, I have a tremor.
Do you want me to do it?
Yes, that would be great, Sabrina. Thank you so much. I usually go by ages. I start with the oldest.
Okay.
So my father's in the
Watch your
center.
step.
My parents were 3 weeks apart, so we had a joint birthday. So that is Clayton in the center, and then to the left is my mother, Gertrude. To the right is my older sister, Kay. Then her brother, all of our brother, the oldest boy is Brian. On the left is his twin brother, Bruce, who you should know because he's local here in town. In the back row on the right is my brother, Buddy. And then my sister Adelaide Elaine, who is known commonly as Gigi, and then my sister Ginny, myself, and then of course my sister Trudy, the youngest, the baby as we called her. And then if you go to 1989, this is the family joining together for the 50th wedding anniversary at the Seventh Lake House. Now keep in mind, as you'll find out, my parents met across the lake at Woodhome. And so we teased him on this day that Mom and Dad, took you 50 years, all you've done is cross the lake. And so this is the family. I believe I put down there that if you were to put all of the family and descendants now, I think there's 36 more that you would have to add. Yes, 36 more people would have to be in this picture. You see Earl Burth and Lillian Burth on the right, and in front of them is my dad's sister, Aunt Beverly. The rest of them are children, the spouses, and the grandchildren here. So that's just when we get together. All right, the next one, please. Now, historians have to ask ourselves the question, from whence have we come? 3 of the 4 of my grandparents were first-generation Americans, which meant that their parents were all immigrants. That makes my parents second generation, and I and my sibling third generation. No, go back, please. This one I'm going to talk about. Clayton's father's parents were Gustav and Regina Gribneau. They immigrated from Elbring, Prussia in 1881. He was a furrier. He sewed coats and hats for a living and taught it to his son Max, my great uncle. Clayton's mother's ancestors were some of the very earliest Puritan settlers of New England. The earliest I could find was 1631. That's 11 years after the Mayflower. So you know that they were coming to an untamed wild country. And they later helped to found early settlements, particularly in New England, especially in New Haven, Connecticut. And we'll talk about that later. Now, my mother's father's parents were Wunable and Josepha Burth. And they immigrated in, well, as close as I can tell, between 1856, when their son George was born in Germany, and 1861, when my grandfather was born in Deerfield, New York. He was a stonemason and a stone cutter. He actually stone cutter's disease died of. And then my mother's parents were Michael and Maria Van Hatten. And the Van Hattens came from Alsace-Lorraine, which is on the Franco-German border. Sometimes it's German, sometimes it's French. And they arrived in 1831. And Michael Van Hatten was a farmer, he was an auctioneer, he taught Sunday school, and he was the road commissioner in Marcy. They started out, the first farm that the Van Hattens owned was 1836 in Deerfield, New York. The parents, actually. And then Michael moved to Marcy, and there's a number of Van Hatten descendants in Marcy, and particularly in the fire company down there. Okay, now here's Regina Gribneau with her grandson Clayton Sr. About 1918, I assume, because Dad was born in 1917. Now if you go a little further, well, I believe that's New Forest Cemetery in Utica, because that's where her husband Gustav was buried in 1895 when he died. He only lived in the States 14 years before he passed. The next, please. Now Regina, and this is her daughter Agatha Gribneau. This is Clayton Sr.'s grandmother and his Aunt Agatha. As I said, she immigrated from Elbring, Prussia with her husband Gustav in 1881. They had 2 sons with them on the ship. Max was a baby, Max got sick, and the other passengers wanted to toss the baby overboard. That didn't happen, fortunately. But she is the person, the woman on the left, is the person who brought 8-year-old Clayton to Inlet in 1925. And so that's where I'm getting the 99 years. For perhaps the first visit. Perhaps they may have come earlier, I don't know. But this is what my father said. He was 8 years old when they came. They stayed across from the Wood Hotel in the garage apartment. I believe that's property that was recently owned by Penny Stewart on the hill there. So that's where he stayed. That was the very first visit, 1925. But I believe she brought other children, not just her grandson, because within 2 years they were operating a business here, as we'll see in a moment. Next, please. This is a very poignant and powerful image to me and my family. This is young Clayton with Adelaide, his baby sister. The story behind this is the Great Depression. My dad and his little sister ended in the House of Good Shepherd orphanage in Utica. Well, my dad didn't like that, and so he ran away. He left his baby sister there. He never saw her again. A few months later, she died of pneumonia. When my father was on his deathbed, 62 years later, he started to weep because he could not save his baby sister. He was only 12 years old. So it's a powerful image. It's the only image I know of Adelaide, so that was pretty priceless when I found it. This is Oscar Gribneau. He was the owner of Dad's Inn since 1927. And I believe Oscar built it for 2 reasons. number one, in a photo you'll see in a few moments, the highway was just going through to Racket Lake. That contract was let in 1929. So there was no real highway to Racket Lake prior to that. He started Dad's Inn in 1927, according to his obituary. And the second reason I think that he built it is because of the standard seam roof. My grandfather, Alfred, who you'll meet in a moment, was a tinsmith. And if you go up to 7th Lake Corner and look at Dad's Inn before it falls down, and you look at Drake's Inn, and you look down the road at some of the Clayton's cottages, you will see the standard seam roof that a tinsmith installed, and that was my grandfather. So I figured, well, Grandpa put the roof on it, and it was his brother's place. They probably built it, but I can't verify that. But 1927 is pretty early. Now, he also is responsible for selling one of the lots to my father in 1936 for Clayton's cottages. My father paid $100 for one lakefront lot. Okay, the other lot, the second lakefront lot at Clayton's, was purchased from Jenny Galvin, who is the agent in charge for the Fulton Chain Club, as most of you know, for James Galvin, her husband that had passed. Next, please. All right, now you have Edith, who is sister of Oscar, Alfred, and daughter, and Agatha. On the right, way over to the right, Sabrina. There we go. Whoa, we got two of them. Here we go. See who gets there first, right? That's my Aunt Edith. And in the center seated is her husband, Eugene Helpman. And they began operating the Little Shamrock restaurant down the road on 7th Lake in about 29, 2 years later. Up on the left, the woman is Agatha.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Who is this gentleman?
This is Eugene Helpin. We called him Uncle Gene.
He's part of the Gribneau family, correct?
No, he's a Helpin. His father owned the Shamrock Restaurant, I'll get right there in a second, the Shamrock Restaurant on Genesee Street in Utica, and the restaurant they had up here, down near what most of you know as Payne's Boat Livery, the Little Shamrock, he started up here. Sabrina, what?
The ears.
Right.
I mean, that is like a total Clayton, Michael,
Could be, but
a whole lot of you.
The ears, right? They're giving away.
asked a lot of questions.
Sorry,
That's Annie, the one that Mom said always made Christmas dinner because she was too busy doing all the Christmas stuff for us. The one who put on the reception for them at the restaurant. In the upper left is Aunt Agatha, we called her Aunt Ag, and her husband on the top there is Warren Woodhull. And they moved to Pennsylvania and had a tavern down to Bradford, Pennsylvania, as I recall. Next, please. Next, Charles.
I got it working here.
Okay. Now we're turning to my mother's side. This is the Van Hatten. In the center, the gentleman with the whiskers is Michael Van Hatten, who came to America in Van Hatten's 1831 when he was 3 years old. And on the right is Maria Herstal Van Hatten, his wife. She and all of her 5 or 6 sisters were all named Maria, and the thing that was different was the middle name. Rachel, and their mother was Maria Spiegler, so they loved the name Maria. Upper left, the lady right there, right there, is Clara Emma Van Hatten, who married John J. Burth, and that is my mother's mother. Unfortunately, she died much too young, as we'll get to. The other person that you might know about, the lower right, the couple with the children sitting on their laps, the gentleman is George Kunkel, and his wife is Louise Van Hatten Kunkel. You may have heard of Kunkel Ambulances in Utica, New York, and that's the family line, that branch of the family that went that way. Next, please. Okay, well, that got in there twice.
You go the wrong way.
Oh, you're going the wrong way, okay. Now, the next photo is my parents' wedding photo. Again, this is Clara Emma Van Hatten and John J. Burth. Jeannie Van Hatten, their daughter, my mother's older sister by, I think, 6 years, who was married to Fred Seavey, were the 2 witnesses. You can go ahead, please. There you go. Seated is my grandmother, Clara Emma Van Hatten Burth, and next to her is her husband, John J. Burth, my grandfather. And then my great aunt, Jeannie up there, Jeannie Van Hatten Seavey, and Fred Seavey, her husband. The Van Hattens were basically out of Marcy, New York. The Burths were out of Deerfield. John Jay, that man was, he was alive when Abraham Lincoln, my grandfather was alive when Abraham Lincoln was president. He was born November 30th, 1861. So that always astounds me. My grandfather, you know, wow. Next, please. Okay, now we're going to start with some family businesses, and I tried to do them in the order that they happened. The first business that the Gribneaus owned in Inlet was Dad's Inn, and it was operated first in 1927 by my great-uncle Oscar. He was joined by my grandfather, Alfred, his brother, in 1929. 1929 was a very hard year. And then he was joined when he married Nettie. Nettie's full name was it was actually Helen Nettie Woodhouse Cole Gribneau. She was first married to Stanley Cole, and when Stanley was alive, she and him owned a great number of the cottage properties on the island where today Payne's Boat Livery is. In fact, when I was a child, Aunt Nettie owned the 3 cottages on the point. I used to go there with my siblings and would play in the lean-to over 7th Lake. Nettie was, go ahead please. Now this is my grandfather and his brother. The gentleman in white is Oscar, the older brother, born in Germany. The further back is my grandfather, Alfred, who was born here in America. I'm not going to repeat the date. But you can see Dad's Inn in the background. Now, if you look at the text, it says, I think this is about circa 1930, because remember the road to Racket was contracted in 1929. So why would there be a gas station until there was a road, right? So I think they built this, but I can't per se for certain. But that's my great-uncle and my grandfather there. So we've been around 7 Lake Corner for a while. Okay, and here is Nettie alone. Unfortunately, 5 years after they were married in 1935, in 1940 on a trip down to Daytona Beach, Florida. In February of 1940, Oscar passed away. That left Nettie there through my whole childhood. We always went over there for candy, ice cream, and that was Aunt Nettie. Notice behind Dad's Inn there were 2 rental cottages. And the pine trees there my father planted, and I was so sad when they went down. They were great big trees when I was a kid, and now they're gone. But my dad said he planted those trees there. And that is Aunt Nettie, who spelled her name different than us, even though she lived across the street. Next, please. Okay, and this is one of Nettie's rental cottages, and this is a topless view of my sister Kay around directly across from our house. Oh, blow it up, Wayne.
She does have a crucifix on.
All right, thank you. We better move on. Okay, and this is Babcock's about the same time in the early 40s. Hank and Gladdy bought from Johnny and Frankie Stages. The Stages built that about 1936, 1937, because they were constructing, was the same time my parents were constructing next door. And then Hank and Gladdy actually purchased it, I believe it was 1942, and then he, of course, sold it to the Drakes in the 70s. Al and Audrey Drake. So that's just an old scene of what the corner was like. But he used to go over there and pump gas at and that. He was very close to Hank and Gladdy, very close, because he worked for them. Next, please. Okay, we need to stop here. My question to you is, how did Clayton come to settle in Inlet? Well, my dad's story is one of riches to rags, to a lifetime of hard work, determination, and resilience, which ultimately led to my parents helping their 8 children acquire a business, build a home, or further their education. Dad said his wealth was in his children. I'll never forget that. How was it they had wealth initially? My dad's maternal grandfather was Charles Clayton Hayes. So my grandmother's father, middle name, was Clayton. She chose to name her son, my father, Clayton Alfred. Alfred was his actual father. So that's where the name came from. Now, Charles Clayton Hayes and his father, Enoch Hayes, were very successful. They manufactured carriages and wagons in New Haven, Connecticut. When the wagons and the horse, obviously, trade that stopped, they transitioned into automobile accessories. And apparently they were coast to coast. because as I read my great-great-grandfather's obituary, it said that Charles Clayton Hayes was in Los Angeles on business at the time that his father was dying in New Haven, Connecticut, and he had to take a train back across the country. At any event, when Charles Clayton Hayes passed away in 1919 in Asbury Park, New Jersey, he only had 3 dependents. He had about 6 children, but for various reasons, there were only 3 left. You know, that's how life was hard. So my grandmother inherited a very substantial sum of money. And the earlier photos of my dad would show him in a beautiful carriage, beautifully dressed, much different than a few years later. That was in 1919 that she inherited that money. 10 years later, 1929, and the Great Depression struck. The money was invested in stocks. So, like for many people in our country, my grandparents hit on hard times. Not only that, they had lost 3 infant babies. My dad believes it may have been due to lactose intolerance that weakened them, because he told me himself that he was saved by drinking goat's milk. At any rate, the babies passed away like 6, 8 weeks, 2 months. They were infants. So that's a terrible tragedy for any parents. I believe the stress of all that was the result, caused my grandparents to separate. They never divorced. Clayton's dad, Alfred, came to Inlet. Where else do you go? He was known as Herr for his happy-go-lucky disposition. So he moved to Inlet on the 7th Lake Road, and his wife, Margaret Louise Hayes, Gribneau, stayed in Utica the rest of her life. Okay? They never divorced. Now what this meant, in 1929, my father and sister, the sole surviving children at that point, were put in the House of the Good Shepherd Children's Home in Utica, New York. And that was the late fall of October 29. Well, my dad didn't like that. So what he did, he got a bicycle, and with 50 cents in his pocket, he rode himself alone to Inlet, New York, because he knew he had relatives up here. It's the only place, obviously, he knew where to go. His grandmother had brought him up here. He never went back to Utica to live. The sad part of the story is, as I mentioned earlier, he left Adelaide there, and she died in February of 1930. And he carried that on his heart, that burden, his whole life. It was a very touching moment when he was dying. So, now the first winter he arrived in Inlet, he told me he spent his time sewing balsam pillows that could be sold the next summer in his Uncle Oscar's gift shop at Dad's Inn. He told me his first real job in the Adirondacks was back in the lumber camps. And his job was to tend to the horses, to groom them, to feed them, to water them. Okay? But he said he was also responsible when the men were skidding out the timber, to walk between the horse and the logs, keeping the reins from being tangled and feeding them to the driver. This is a very dangerous thing for a 13-year-old boy to be doing. In the winter you had snow and ice, in the spring you had mud. It was quite dangerous for him. He also spoke about his arm and his shoulder freezing to the wall in the winter of these hunting camps. And he also talked about going to bed hungry during the Great Depression. And so we weren't allowed to waste food in our house. That was definitely wrong. When they were first married, my mother once sent my brothers, Brian and Bruce, to bed without dinner. My father came home and he said, "No, my children eat. I went to bed without food." He said, "You can discipline, but they don't go hungry." He was we were always warm and we were always fed. We always had that kind of security with my dad. Okay, now we want to go through the Woodhome years. By the time he was a teenager, he became employed at Woodhome. Woodhome was then an Adirondack resort on the north shore of 7th Lake, nothing beyond it but state land. The only way to get there was a trail or to take a boat. My father's job was caretaker, handyman, guide the tourists on hiking trips, take them fishing, get the firewood, Basically, and what he remembers most is hauling all the supplies down from Ed Avery's boat livery. Today it's called Payne's, but in those days it was Ed Avery's. And he had to bring down supplies in order by boat. So, let's go ahead and I'll talk on these slides. Thank you. This is Harley and Mabel Grandma Brown's home. You may recognize it. It's in Old Forge, New York on Main Street. I believe J.R. Risley and his mom, Marge Risley, I think his dad was Bruce Risley, I believe they lived there for many years when I was in school. The home is still there. They would spend summers at Wood Home and winters they moved to Old Forge. Next, please. Now this is Harley Brown, the owner of Wood Home, my father's employer. When I was going through their important papers, I came across an indenture dated March 1937, in which my father had requested and received a loan from his employer, Harley Brown. And as I read further, the reason for the loan was to build an Adirondack cottage, and it was for $300. Now, Dad had just bought the vacant land at Clayton's, the forest, in 1936, and in the spring of 1937, he was getting a $300 loan. Can you imagine, to build a cottage? He was still a minor, so it's the only place I've ever seen my grandfather's signature. His grandfather co-signed the loan for him. But Harley Brown is remembered as giving us the seed money to start Clayton's cottages. So I had to remember him. Now this is his wife. We called her Grandma Brown. That's how familiar we were. My dad worked there for many years. This is Grandma Brown and one of her, I mean, they were pretty independent up there, you know. They pretty much at the end of the line, so you had to do everything. So these are some of the old Wood Home photos. So he worked there as a teenager. I'm not sure when that ended, but he worked for quite a while, certainly in 36 and 37 when he started Clayton's. Next, please. And here he is with Grandma Brown again at Wood Home, obviously there. And another one, please. And this is the boathouse. And as I said, he worked as caretaker, handyman, and guide. Next, please. All right, this is kind of a powerful image to me, too. Remember, he was very young, and he was very poor. So he got himself a boat and a little motor that doesn't look too big to me, but he used that boat to go from Dad's Inn. He'd walk down the road. He'd get to the Little Shamrock Restaurant, his aunt's and dad's place there, and then he'd go up to Wood Home. And then in 1937 and beyond, he would take that boat after work and he would go down the channel to the site for the future Clayton's cottages. And as he built it, he told me, one night he put in a door, one night he put in a window. So it was all done, at least initially, after work, because he was still employed at Harley Brown's Wood Home Hotel. But that's how he got around in those days. Next, please. This is just him with an unknown guest there at Wood Home, obviously during the winter season. There you go. There you go.
Sorry.
That's all right. He was young there, isn't he? You can tell these are the early days.
Where is Wood Home?
Wood Home is on the North Shore of 7th Lake.